There are places on this planet where one look is enough to understand that people were never really meant to remain. Cliffs fall straight into emptiness. Mountain ridges seem too narrow for even a single house. Entire settlements cling to slopes, ledges, and rock faces where the land itself appears to reject the very idea of human life. And yet, people built there. Not for a season, not as a temporary refuge, but for generations. They cut paths into stone. They anchored walls into mountains. They fastened homes to steep hillsides and made lives for themselves in places where one wrong step could mean the end of everything. What emerged from that effort is more than a collection of villages, monasteries, and ancient structures. These places are the record of something quieter, deeper, and harder to break. The human will to carry the idea of home into landscapes that never meant to allow it. This journey takes us to some of the most astonishing places on Earth: settlements above gorges, sanctuaries balanced on rock spires, and dwellings suspended between cloud, stone, and open space. Places where architecture and landscape do not simply exist side by side, but seem to test each other. And maybe that is why these places matter, because they reveal something large cities often hide. They show how far human beings are willing to go, not only to survive, but to belong. Meteora, monasteries suspended above the world. At first glance, Meteora does not feel entirely real. Great pillars of stone rise almost straight out of the plain, as if the earth itself were trying to lift its weight into the sky. And on top of some of those towering rocks stand monasteries so high, so improbable, that for a moment you forget they were built by human hands at all. That is what makes this place so powerful. Over immense stretches of time, wind, rain, and geological upheaval shaped these near-vertical formations into something that already looked beyond ordinary life. Then, centuries later, monks chose those summits as places of retreat and devotion. Reaching them was once an ordeal in itself. Rope ladders, nets, and painstaking lifts suspended above open air. When morning mist rises from the valley floor, the lower half of the rock towers disappears, and Meteora seems to drift between earth and sky. In those moments, it no longer feels like a landscape in the usual sense. It feels like a threshold, a place suspended between the physical world and something more distant, more inward, more sacred. But Meteora is more than a dramatic view. It is a place where nature, height, silence, and belief come together with unusual force. It reminds us that people do not always seek meaning in comfort or safety. Sometimes they climb precisely where the world feels most unreachable and build there anyway. And that is why Meteora belongs near the beginning of this journey, because it shows almost immediately what these places reveal about us: that human beings have always been willing to carry faith, order, and belonging into landscapes that seem to leave no room for any of them. Bonifacio, a town built over empty sea. Bonifacio is one of those places that makes you ask, almost immediately, how it can possibly be there at all. Its old town stands on the very edge of a pale limestone cliff, high above the sea, as if it had deliberately chosen the narrowest and most precarious ground this coastline could offer. From a distance, the houses seem almost weightless, their walls press so close to the brink that they appear less built on land than suspended over open water. That is what gives Bonifacio its unsettling beauty. For centuries, the sea has been eating away at the base of the cliff. Below, water gnaws at the rock. Above, an entire town rests on it. The result is a place that looks as if it is living on borrowed ground. A human settlement balanced on a shelf of stone that should feel too thin to hold it. Even the cliff itself seems strangely unreal. The white limestone lies in long, horizontal layers, stacked one above another like the pages of an ancient book. And on top of those pages sit streets, walls, and houses, as if people had learned to make a home directly on the exposed history of the earth. Inside the old town, the grand view gives way to something tighter and more intimate. The lanes are narrow, winding, and shaped by the wind. Nothing feels accidental. Even the closeness of the streets seems like an answer to the force of the open sea. And yet Bonifacio is not only harsh, it also carries something almost theatrical. Light and stone, height and emptiness, sea and wall all meet here so dramatically that the town can feel less like a real settlement than like the set of an old legend. But Bonifacio is no legend. It is a real place where people have spent centuries learning how to live with height, exposure, and the unending pressure of the sea. And that is what makes it unforgettable. Because here, once again, we see something essential about human beings. Not only our ability to endure difficult landscapes, but our strange instinct to create beauty precisely where the world feels least willing to hold us. Wangxian Valley, China's city on the cliffs. Wangxian Valley looks like the kind of place that should exist only in a legend. From below, the whole settlement seems to cling to the mountainside against all reason. Houses, roofs, balconies, and lantern light layered one above another along the cliff, as if gravity has somehow loosened its grip. When fog moves through the valley, that illusion becomes even stronger. The town no longer seems anchored to the mountain at all. It appears to hover somewhere between rock, cloud, and empty space. But that is what makes Wangxian Valley so compelling. This is not an ancient city that somehow survived untouched. It is the result of transformation. What once stood here was a damaged granite quarry marked by industrial scars and environmental strain. Over time, that wounded landscape was reshaped into something that now feels almost mythic. And yet the deeper story is not fantasy, it is engineering. Much of what looks old, handmade, and quietly traditional is supported by modern structural design hidden inside the mountain itself. Steel anchors were driven deep into the rock and concealed so carefully that the buildings seemed to rest there naturally, like old timber structures that had always belonged to the cliff. What you see is the image of the past. What holds it together is the precision of the present. Even the surfaces were designed with that illusion in mind. Instead of bright finishes and polished new materials, the builders used local earth tones, straw, and traditional techniques to give the facades a rougher, weathered skin. The result is a place that does not feel like a conventional development project. It feels like something that emerged slowly from dust, stone, and memory. From the valley floor, the gray tiled roofs rise in layers like nests built into a sheer wall. And at dusk, when warm lantern light begins to move through the mist, Wangxian Valley takes on a strangely tender atmosphere. The technical achievement is still there, but it no longer feels purely technical. It becomes mood, quiet, distant, and almost dreamlike. But even that beauty has an edge to it. Spend a night in a room near the cliff, and the height stops being abstract. You hear the wind, you hear the water, you feel the drop, and very quickly the place reminds you that it was not built only to be admired, it was built to be experienced. That is why Wangxian Valley belongs near the beginning of this journey, because in a single view, it captures the deeper impulse behind all these places, the human desire to build even where the land itself seems to say no. Paro Taktsang, the monastery hanging above Bhutan. There are places that seem unreal even from a distance. Paro Taktsang is one of them. Clinging to a near vertical cliff high above Bhutan's Paro Valley, the monastery appears less constructed than suspended. Its white walls, golden roofs, and dark rock face come together in a way that feels both weightless and precarious, as if this sacred place had been set down at the very edge of the possible. And that is exactly what gives it its power. Paro Taktsang is not simply beautiful, it feels earned. The path leading there is long, steep, and demanding. The climb takes time. It asks for patience, breath, and focus. And by the time the monastery finally comes fully into view, it no longer feels like a place you have casually arrived at. It feels like a place you have approached with intention. That changes the experience of it. Because Paro Taktsang is more than a building in an extreme location. It is a place where effort, height, silence, and belief begin to merge. The closer you get, the less the cliff feels like a barrier, and the more it becomes a kind of stage, a sheer wall holding wind, prayer, and human resolve in fragile balance. There is also something important in the monastery's endurance. Fire and damage have touched it more than once, yet it remains one of Bhutan's strongest symbols. Not because it is large, and not because it dominates the landscape in the usual sense, but because it expresses something harder to forget, the willingness to place what is sacred where the world feels most difficult to reach. That may be why Paro Taktsang lingers in the mind long after the climb is over. It is not only the height, or the danger, or even the beauty of the setting. It is the feeling that human beings, time and again, have chosen the most improbable places not just to survive, but to seek meaning there. Ronda, a city split by the earth. In Ronda, it feels as though the land itself once broke apart and left a town standing at the edge of the wound. A deep gorge cuts straight through the heart of the city, steep, jagged, and so sudden that Ronda seems less like a place that simply grew over time and more like a place forced to prove it could endure. Along the rim of that vast opening stand pale houses with walls, windows, and balconies hanging over empty space, as if the abyss had long since become part of daily life. That constant nearness to the drop is what makes Ronda so striking. The town rests on a high, rocky plateau that gave it protection for centuries and lifted it above the surrounding land. But the image that defines it is the great stone bridge joining both sides of the gorge once again. It feels like more than a piece of engineering. It feels like a human answer to a landscape that seemed determined to divide itself. And that is where Ronda finds its power. People here do not live in spite of the gorge. They live with it. The emptiness below is not pushed out of sight. It remains part of the town's shape, its rhythm, and its identity. That is what makes Ronda memorable. It shows that even where the earth leaves behind a violent break, people still try to create continuity. Not only a place to survive, but a place of balance, beauty, and permanence. Gaztelugatxe, the stairway rising out of the ocean. San Juan de Gaztelugatxe feels like a place the sea allowed for only a moment. Off the wild coast of northern Spain, this small rocky island rises out of the Atlantic, battered by wind, ringed by waves, and cut off from the mainland except for a narrow stone bridge and a long stairway that curves upward over the water. Even from a distance, it carries the feeling of separation, as if it belongs less to the ordinary world than to some older, harsher edge of it. That is what makes Gaztelugatxe so powerful. The path does not simply take you there. It pulls you out, step by step, away from the safety of land and into exposure. Below, the sea crashes against the rock. Above, there is only sky, wind, and the climb ahead. The experience feels less like arriving at a destination and more like surrendering yourself to the landscape on its own terms. The ascent is part of the place's meaning. Hundreds of stone steps lead upward to the small chapel at the summit. It is not a vast structure, and the island itself is not enormous. But that is almost the point. Gaztelugatxe does not overwhelm through scale. It overwhelms through position, through the thinness of the connection, the nearness of the drop, and the feeling that one simple path has been stretched to the very edge of the world. And that may be why it stays with people, because it shows how little it sometimes takes for a human-made path to feel profound. Just stone, sea, wind, and height, and suddenly a staircase becomes something more than a staircase. It becomes a threshold between shelter and exposure, between the familiar world and the open force beyond it. Fanjingshan, the sacred peak lost in the clouds. Fanjingshan looks as if a piece of the earth had risen straight into the sky. High above the clouds, this mountain lifts itself out of mist and wind with a kind of lonely severity that barely feels real. Its slopes are steep, its rock raw, and at the summit stand ancient temples perched on two narrow stone pinnacles, separated by a deep crack in the mountain and joined only by a small bridge. Even that image alone feels less like a natural landscape than something preserved from a legend. That is where the power of Fanjingshan begins. The climb is not effortless. It asks for endurance, patience, and a willingness to keep ascending long after the world below has started to fall away. And that is what changes the experience of the mountain. The higher you go, the less weight the ordinary world seems to carry. Rock, cloud, silence, and altitude draw so close together that the line between physical place and spiritual space begins to blur. Fanjingshan is not striking only because it is beautiful. It is striking because height itself becomes part of the meaning. This is not just a peak to be admired from afar. It is a place where elevation turns into experience, where distance from the world below begins to feel like a form of clarity. And perhaps that is why people have sought the sacred in places like this for centuries. Not because such places are easy to reach, but because they are not. Because sometimes the most powerful sense of the holy appears where the earth seems least willing to make room for us at all. Abuna Yemata Gu, the church reached by fear and faith. Some sacred places ask for reverence. Abuna Yemata Gu asks for courage first. High in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, this church sits in a place that feels less like a destination than a test. Long before anyone reaches the doorway, the landscape begins to strip away every illusion of ease. The approach leads across steep, exposed rock, over rough ground, and finally onto a narrow ledge where the mountain falls away into open space. By that point, the journey no longer feels symbolic. It feels physical, immediate, and deeply human. Your footing matters, your nerves matter, your willingness to keep moving matters. And that is exactly what gives this place its force. Abuna Yemata Gu was not built where access was simple or safety was guaranteed. It was placed where arrival itself becomes part of the meaning. The climb demands more than effort. It demands trust in the stone, in the body, and for many who come here, in something beyond both. Then after all that bare rock and exposure, the interior opens like a secret preserved above the world. Inside the church, ancient wall paintings still glow from the stone, alive with color, memory, and devotion. The space is small, quiet, and hidden, yet it holds a presence far greater than its size would suggest. After the tension of the ascent, that stillness lands differently. It does not feel decorative, it feels earned. That contrast is what makes Abuna Yemata Gu so unforgettable. Outside, there is risk, height, and the constant awareness of the drop. Inside, there is calm, order, and the feeling that faith has been held in place here for centuries against every practical argument. The church does not deny the danger around it. It exists in direct conversation with it. And maybe that is why this place says so much about the human story, because it shows in one of the clearest ways possible that people have often chosen to place what matters most where reaching it requires everything they have. Not because hardship is beautiful in itself, but because some forms of belief seem to deepen when they are carried through fear. At Abuna Yemata Gu, faith is not separated from the climb. It begins inside it. Phugtal, the hidden monastery in the rock. Phugtal does not look like a structure that was simply built. It looks as if it slowly emerged from the mountain itself. Deep in the Himalayas, this monastery clings to a steep cliff above a narrow gorge, so remote and so improbably placed that it seems to leave ordinary architecture behind altogether. From a distance, the complex resembles a pale honeycomb fastened to dark stone, holding on there in silence for centuries. That is what makes Phugtal so remarkable. It was not set down on open ground with a clear foundation beneath it. Instead, wooden beams were fitted deep into cracks and irregularities in the rock, turning the cliff face itself into the monastery's supporting frame. Rooms, roofs, and narrow passages interlock so tightly that the whole place feels less like a single building and more like a vertical, living web suspended against the mountain. And the journey there is part of its meaning. No one arrives at Phugtal casually. Reaching it requires walking through rough, isolated terrain for hours, sometimes longer. That effort changes the way the place is felt. By the time it finally comes into view, the monastery no longer seems like an attraction. It feels like something preserved by distance, patience, and the refusal of the landscape to give itself away easily. Maybe that is why Phugtal still holds on to something many places have lost: silence. Not the absence of sound alone, but a deeper stillness. The sense that rock, height, time, and devotion have been allowed to settle into one another without interruption. And that may be the clearest lesson in Phugtal. In extreme landscapes, architecture does not always mean conquering nature. Sometimes it means fitting so precisely within it that stone, altitude, and human belief begin to form a single thing. Fragile at first glance, yet enduring far longer than seems possible. Dhankar, life on the edge of the Himalayas. Dhankar feels as if the wind itself had set it down at the edge of the world. High in the Himalayas, the village clings to a steep slope like an old earthen fortress, surrounded by dry, open space, sharply cut landforms, and a landscape that seems shaped more by force than by comfort. Even from a distance, it looks fragile, as if the mountain might one day simply shrug it off and reclaim it. That is exactly what makes Dhankar so striking. The houses and monastery do not rest on solid, permanent rock, but on compacted earth and ancient sediment. The ground beneath them is not fully stable. What stands here stands on terrain that can slowly shift, wear away, and change. And yet people built here with simple materials: mud, stone, timber, and sun-dried brick. Nothing about the construction feels extravagant. Everything feels necessary. The settlement folds so naturally into the slope that it seems less like something imposed on the mountain than something that grew out of it. That balance between belonging and vulnerability is what gives Dhankar its emotional weight. It is beautiful, but never in a safe or comfortable way. Every wall, every ledge, every narrow structure seems to remind you that life here has always depended on living with uncertainty rather than overcoming it. And that may be what Dhankar reveals most clearly. Some places do not inspire us because they appear strong. They inspire us because they remain standing even while fragility is written into their very foundations. Here, on the high, dry edge of the Himalayas, beauty and instability exist side by side, and people learn to make a home between them. Katskhi Pillar, the Hermitage above the valley. Rising out of a green valley in western Georgia, Katskhi Pillar looks less like a mountain than a single piece of stone left behind by another world. Narrow, vertical, and strangely isolated, it stands apart from everything around it, and on its small summit sits a modest hermitage, far above the ground, far above ordinary life, as if the entire purpose of the place were distance itself. That is what gives Katskhi Pillar its unusual power. This is not a broad ridge or a dramatic mountaintop with room to spare. It is a near freestanding limestone column with only a small space at the top, which makes the very idea of building there feel almost unreasonable. And yet that is precisely where people chose to create a place of retreat. For centuries, the pillar was abandoned and nearly forgotten. But even in silence, it never lost its symbolic force. Because the structure above does not impress through size or grandeur. It stays in the mind for a different reason. It suggests a deliberate turning away from excess, from noise, from the weight of the world below. Even today, the ascent itself makes that clear. A steep metal ladder runs straight up the rock, and just looking at it is enough to understand that this was never meant to be a place for crowds. It was meant for solitude, for discipline, for the kind of spiritual life that seeks not comfort, but separation. And maybe that is why Katskhi Pillar feels so unforgettable. It shows that sacred space does not always depend on scale. Sometimes it is created through height, loneliness, and the radical decision to rise above everything unnecessary. Here, suspended above the valley, faith becomes not only something believed, but something physically withdrawn from the world. Vardzia, the secret city carved into a mountain. At first, Vardzia barely reveals itself. From a distance, it looks like little more than a long wall of rock, another harsh mountain face shaped by time and weather. But then the details begin to emerge. Openings, shadows, ledges in carved recesses. And slowly it becomes clear that this was once not just a shelter, but an entire hidden world cut directly into the mountain. That is what makes Vardzia so extraordinary. This was not a city assembled stone by stone in the usual way. It was hollowed out from within. Chambers, corridors, stairways, and living spaces were carved straight into the cliff, creating a multi-level settlement that spread across the rock face like a secret architecture concealed inside the earth itself. And for a long time, much of that world remained protected by the mountain. It was only after a major earthquake tore away part of the outer rock that the scale of Vardzia became more visible. What had once been hidden inside the slope was suddenly exposed, as if the mountain had been forced to surrender one of its oldest secrets. Even now, after damage and centuries of erosion, Vardzia still carries immense presence. It feels less like a ruin in the ordinary sense than like the surviving framework of an idea. The idea that a mountain could become a fortress, a refuge, and a city all at once. Inside its carved spaces, you can still sense the discipline and intention that shaped it. Nothing about it feels casual. Everything feels born from necessity. And that may be why Vardzia lingers in the mind, because it reminds us that in the hardest landscapes, people have not always tried to stand against the mountain. Sometimes they went deeper. They entered the stone itself and built a world within it. Maijishan, the cliffside caves of devotion. From a distance, Maijishan looks almost like a mountain where a second hidden world has suddenly come into view. Along a high, reddish cliff, caves, stairways, and narrow walkways emerge from the rock and trace themselves across the steep face like a delicate web. The whole scene feels calm and daring at the same time, as if a place of devotion had been created exactly where the journey itself would already demand humility. That tension between beauty and risk is what gives Maijishan its power. Over centuries, nearly 200 caves were carved into the smooth cliff and linked by exterior paths and stairs clinging closely to the mountain. From below, it all appears almost fragile, as though this entire spiritual world were holding itself against a nearly vertical wall by sheer determination. But inside, the atmosphere changes completely. There, another world opens, one shaped not by exposure, but by stillness. Thousands of Buddhist figures, formed from clay, plant fibers, and natural materials, have endured here across many generations. That is what makes Maijishan more than an extraordinary sight in the landscape. It also feels like an archive in stone, preserving layers of belief, memory, and artistic devotion from different eras. And maybe that is the real force of this place. Outside, there is the raw cliff, the height, and the awareness of danger. Inside, there is order, silence, and the persistence of faith. Maijishan shows that even on a nearly inaccessible wall of rock, people were not seeking only shelter or elevation. They were also trying to create continuity, a place where devotion could outlast the difficulties of the landscape around it. That is why Maijishan lingers in the mind. It feels less like a monument imposed on nature than like a quiet spiritual world drawn directly out of the cliff itself. Kandovan, the village carved out of stone. Some places do not look built at all. They look as if they simply happened. Kandovan in northwestern Iran is one of those places. Sharp, cone-shaped rock formations rise from the ground like a field of stone chimneys, and inside them, people have lived for centuries. From the outside, it feels less like a village than a strange, natural formation no one should have been able to inhabit. And yet it has long been exactly that, a place of shelter, routine, and daily life. That is what makes Kandovan so remarkable. Many of these volcanic rock cones were hollowed out over generations and turned into multi-level homes. Animals were often kept below, family life unfolded above. Higher spaces stored food and supplies. What began as raw stone slowly became a vertical world shaped by use, need, and patience. Even moving through Kandovan follows a different logic. There are few flat streets, only steep steps, narrow passages, and routes cut directly into the rock. Walking here feels less like crossing a village and more like making your way through a lived-in maze carved by time. But the deeper strength of Kandovan is not only visual. The rock itself makes life possible. In summer, the interiors stay naturally cool. In winter, the stone holds warmth far longer than you would expect. What looks harsh and primitive from the outside reveals a kind of practical intelligence once you understand how it works. And that may be what Kandovan shows so clearly. Architecture does not always mean placing something on the land. Sometimes it means entering the land so completely that the boundary disappears. Here, human life was not laid over nature. It was drawn into it, until stone and shelter became almost impossible to separate. Uplistsikhe, the ancient city hollowed from rock. Uplistsikhe feels less like a ruined city than like a mountain that once learned how to hold human life inside itself. At first, what you see is stone, broad, weathered, and worn by centuries of wind and sun. But as you move closer, the shape of the place begins to change. Rooms appear, passages open, carved chambers and worn spaces emerge from the rock, until it becomes clear that this was once far more than a hillside. It was a city cut directly into the earth. That is what makes Uplistsikhe so extraordinary. This was not architecture laid on top of the land. It was architecture pulled out of it. Over many centuries, halls, living spaces, storage areas, and ceremonial places were carved into the soft rock, turning the slope itself into a functioning world. What remains today still carries that strange power, the sense that human beings did not merely settle here, but entered the mountain and shaped it from within. And with that came layers of history. Long before newer religions reshaped the Caucasus, Uplistsikhe was already an important center, a place where belief, daily life, and survival were all written into stone. Different eras passed through it. Different systems of meaning left their mark. That is why the site does not feel tied to a single moment in time. It feels layered, as if entire chapters of human thought were pressed into the rock, one after another. Walking through Uplistsikhe, that continuity becomes almost physical. The surfaces have been smoothed by age. Openings and chambers still follow the logic of a lived place, not just a monument. It does not feel like a city dropped into the landscape and later abandoned. It feels like memory stored inside the mountain itself. And maybe that is what gives Uplistsikhe its lasting force. It shows how deeply people once carved their world into nature, not only with walls and buildings, but with entire spaces of belief, order, and everyday life. Here, the rock did not simply support a civilization, it became one. Al-Hajjarah, the stone fortress above Yemen. Al-Hajjarah does not look like a town that was built on a mountain. It looks like a town that rose out of the mountain itself. Set along a narrow, rocky ridge in Yemen, its stone towers stand shoulder to shoulder, high above the falling slopes, as if this place had only ever known one direction, upward. From a distance, it feels less like a village than an old stronghold at the edge of the world, severe, self-contained, and shaped by the need to endure. That is what gives Al-Hajjarah its power. The boundary between nature and architecture almost disappears. The houses are built from heavy stone. Their color echoes the rock beneath them. In places, it becomes hard to tell where the mountain ends and the settlement begins. It is as if the ridge itself had slowly taken on the form of walls, windows, and towers. Life here was never easy. The height, the narrowness of the ridge, and the deep isolation demanded discipline from anyone who stayed. But that difficulty also shaped the place. Nothing feels ornamental. Nothing feels wasted. Every structure seems to answer necessity first: shelter, protection, stability, survival. That may be what makes Al-Hajjarah so memorable. It shows that people do not always build in places that offer comfort. Sometimes they build where resilience matters more than ease. And in doing so, they create places that feel less like an imposition on the land than a pact with it. Severe, beautiful, and built to last. White houses on the edge of a volcano. After the severity of so many cliffside strongholds and mountain sanctuaries, can seem almost gentle at first. White houses, terraces, and rounded domes spill along the rim of Santorini's caldera in bright layers, catching the light so cleanly that the whole village appears to drift above the sea. Everything looks open, graceful, and serene. But that calm is built on something far more violent. Stands on the edge of an ancient volcano, shaped by a catastrophe that tore the island apart and left behind one of the most dramatic natural basins in the world. That contrast is what gives the place its unusual force. Does not overwhelm through harshness alone. It overwhelms through composure. Its beauty is so refined, so luminous, that it almost hides the scale of the abyss beneath it. Yet the drop is always there, immense, silent, and volcanic in origin, reminding you that this elegance rests on the rim of destruction. And the village is more deeply tied to the land than it first appears. Many of its homes extend into the volcanic rock itself, using the earth as protection from wind and heat. So what looks from the outside like effortless beauty is also a form of adaptation. The architecture is not simply decorative. It is a response to climate, terrain, and exposure, shaped over time into something both practical and striking. That may be why feels so memorable. It shows that human boldness does not always announce itself through danger in the obvious sense. Sometimes it appears in a quieter form, in the decision to build lightly, beautifully, and with remarkable confidence at the edge of a vast geological wound. And that is what makes belong in this journey, because it reminds us that the impossible is not always dark or forbidding. Sometimes it arrives in white walls, open sky, and stillness, and only later do you realize you are standing on the lip of a volcano. Matera, the city time carved into stone. And then there are places where what overwhelms you is not height alone, but time. Matera is one of them. Here in southern Italy, homes, paths, stairways, and entire living spaces were shaped into pale limestone so long ago that the city can feel less like a settlement built on the land than one fused with it. The sassi of Matera do not simply sit in the landscape, they seem to rise out of it. Roofs become pathways, pathways turn into terraces, and from a distance, The whole place appears almost like a single stone organism, worn into form over centuries. That is what gives Matera its unusual force. It does not tell the story of one dramatic moment or one impossible act of construction. It tells the story of endurance. For an immense stretch of time, the rock here was not just used for shelter. It was patiently turned into a complete human world, a place shaped by necessity, repetition, memory, and daily life. And that changes the feeling of the place. Matera is not only beautiful, it is layered, quiet, almost monumental. Behind its stillness lies a history of hardship, transformation, abandonment, and renewal. You can feel that this is not a city that remained untouched. It is a city that survived being redefined again and again without ever losing its bond with the stone beneath it. That may be why Matera makes such a fitting point near the end of this journey. Many of the places we have seen asked how far people were willing to go to live on cliffs, ridges, and mountains. Matera asks something deeper. How long can human life remain written into the earth itself? Here the answer is measured not in years, but in ages. Because Matera shows that extreme places do not speak only of danger. Some speak of something quieter and more lasting. The ability of human beings to leave such deep traces in the land that, over time, stone itself begins to feel like memory.